Ready, this is International Master Jesse Kraai with a presentation on a recent game from the San Luis World Championship in Argentina. This game was a real slugfest between Topalov and Anand, and I think it will go down as one of the big fights, one of the most interesting games from the World Championship matches in all of history. What I'm going to do, since this is such a long game, is I'm basically going to skip over the opening and talk about the key middle game position. And I'm going to use that position to talk about what I've talked about in earlier lectures concerning Kasparov's idea of talking about chess as an equation, material, time, and quality position. This game was a big slugfest. There were mistakes on many sides, and it went all the way down to the 97th move. And I think what you'll find is it was such a big battle of ideas that in the last rounds of the fight, both fighters were kind of punch-drunk, just pushing each other and hoping for something, but unable to really calculate exactly anymore at the very end. And part of that, I think, was due to this extraordinary encounter in the middle game. Okay, so like I said, I'm going to go through the opening rather quickly. This opening line had been played several times before, and I'll talk about it a little bit as we go along. So it's a Queen's Indian defense, and Dave Vigorito just talked about this opening in an earlier lecture. Good stuff so far. Okay, you see, we've been going rather quickly, and some people, I think, when they see a position like this, and even after this, that the opening moves have been played a lot before, are discouraged from chess in general because it seems like everything feels like it's predetermined, like there's not much thought going on during the game. But I think this game should teach us otherwise, that even in a variation like this, where it seems like everything is predetermined, actually a lot is still going on. So here we have this incredible move, knight c4, introducing all kinds of tactics, been played many times before. And in fact, this incredibly tactical move was played even way before computers became so important in chess. Okay, let's take a look just at what happened first. I think Anand was probably a little bit surprised because Black had been doing fairly well in this variation. In fact, White had just been scoring poorly, and played the standard move knight d3, after which it looks like White has some problems because the bishop is attacked and the rook is attacked. Now, clearly, it would seem like White has some prospects here with his advanced pawn on c6, and various moves had been tried at this point for White to try to gain some kind of advantage. Now, the move that Topalov played had been played only one time before, in 1997, in the game Samovo-Feingold in the Finnish Championship. Let's look at that move. So Topalov played bishop a3. So clearly he wants to retain both of his bishops, and he's willing to give up the exchange for it. And so Anand duly takes on e1, Topalov recaptures, and Anand plays rook e8. So this was the position that Topalov had aimed for. Now in the game with Samovo, what happened was White played a very natural move, and he played bishop e4. Why did he do that? Well, it's kind of standard knowledge that what you'd want to do when you're down the exchange is you want to prevent the opponent from exchanging rooks. And the reason for that is that Black's rooks, when he has two rooks against a rook in our minor piece, duplicate themselves. That is, they often perform the same function. So it would be much better to trade off the rooks from Black's perspective. And that's the typical some thought, say, of the exchange sacrifices. Usually you don't want to then exchange off your rook, and that's why some will play bishop e4 here. Unfortunately, however, for bishop e4, you can just feel the discoordination in white's position, primarily due to this big pin on the e line. So that's why the bluff did something kind of very paradoxical, really, especially when you consider that he had really probably have planned out this position. Okay, so he played rook takes e8, queen takes e8, bishop d5. So this is the position I'd like to spend some time on. Think about. Okay. Let's just stare at this position for a while and talk about it. What do you think about this position? Well, Fritz says, the computer says, that black has a 0.75 advantage. And all that means is that Fritz thinks that black is up 3/4 of a pawn. So, that's one thing interesting already about opening preparation, is we see that Topolov's gone into a line where the computer at least thinks that black is significantly better. And what that shows is that even in this computer age, it doesn't mean that the computer has the last word or can determine what we're saying, what we're thinking about in the opening. A player can still come up with original ideas, and this is definitely one of them. Now, let's maybe step away from Fritz and talk about this position in terms of Kasparov's equation of material, time, and quality of position. And I think it's a good exercise for that equation to use this position. Okay, so let's look. Material, okay, rather simple. We're down the exchange. In typical terms, that's usually seen as 2 pawns. Right? We have a bishop for a rook, and we don't have any pawns for it. That's the easy part. Now let's talk about time. And I think this question of time in this position is very interesting. Because normally, or sometimes at least, it's easy to talk about time in the opening because we can say, well, one side's more developed than the other. We can say, well, he's 2 tempos ahead. He's something like that, 3 tempos, 4 tempos. But here, the question is a lot harder to talk about time because we have to ask time to do what for white, because really when we look at white's position, it's not actually clear what he's going to do. The interesting thing is he sacrificed the whole exchange here, but he doesn't even have any concrete threats. Right? Even in the next couple moves, if black were just to sit, there's nothing that white can do in a concrete way. So before we answer the question of time, let's look at it from black's perspective. Okay? It seems to me that there's kind of a curious circumstance here, because even though white's the one that is sacrificed, it's black who really has some plans here. And it seems to me that black has 3 potential long-term plans. One would be to activate his rook. That's clearly a problem in the black position, is that his rook not active, and it's hemmed in by the c6 pawn. So that's one plan, activating the rook. The next would be to remind white that he has 2 pawns on the queen side, and so advancing those pawns would give white some grief in terms of him having to defend black from getting a passed pawn. The third plan that black has would be to trade off his black square bishop. That would make it a lot easier for him, because then white wouldn't have the 2 bishop advantage. Let's talk about the 2 bishop advantage. No, let's not. Let's use that. Let's save that for the quality of position. Let's just talk about time now. So, black has 3 potential plans, and white has, at the most, maybe the idea of slowly improving his position on the king side with a move like h4 and maybe king g2, and slowly bringing up his forces on the king side. So already we can see from the perspective of time, it's a very curious situation where white doesn't have any particular threat in mind. Okay? So what's happened is, after this huge flurry of opening tactics, we've reached a position where time has basically slowed down. The importance of any given tempo now isn't as important as it was in that huge tactical opening flurry. Now time has slowed down, and white will have the opportunity, or at least he hopes he will have the opportunity, of slowly grinding his opponent down. Okay, let's go on to the third category, quality of position. Here's really where white's compensation lies. He has the two bishops. The rook on c8 is hemmed in. And there's a couple more things we should really think about here. Okay, first, but let's start with the two bishops. The reason the two bishops are inherently strong, especially in a position like this, is that a single bishop lives only on one color. Okay? He can only touch 32 squares of the board. Two bishops, however, are kind of like a single entity because they can control both the black and the white. And when you think about why a rook is stronger than a bishop, it's because a rook can control both squares. Otherwise, it just controls the same amount of squares, but it can control both the black and the white. But the two bishops together can touch both colors, and as such, they're like a beast that can control a piece in itself that can control both colors of squares. So that's the first thing to think about. And clearly the next piece of compensation that's easily recognizable is that the rook on c8 is hemmed in, as we've talked about, by the c6 pawn. It's going to be hard for him to move because if he does try to activate himself, that pawn on c6, we have to worry that it can become a queen at c7 and c8. And now comes, I think, the interesting thing that we have to talk about, because I think the idea here of Toplos is really very deep. And that is to say that not only do we have the two bishops and the rook, but we have a very curious thing happening in that this position resembles one of opposite colored bishops. And let's try to see what I'm talking about. What I'm saying is that in the opposite color middle game, what will happen is that the side with the initiative will be the one who has the advantage. And why is that? Because he'll have a bishop that stands unopposed on a certain color, and the defending side, because he can't defend on that color, will have grave difficulties. And let's talk about why that's the case here. In this position, white has a light square bishop, black doesn't. So the long-term difficulty for black is going to be controlling the key light squares all around his position, even though that at the first glance is not obvious. But like I said before, the reason is it's like a bishop of opposite color middle game, where black cannot defend on the white squares. Okay. Now, after talking about all that, what do you think? How would you assess the position? Now, to Fritz's credit, after I've left him on for a couple hours, he's gone from 0.75 to 0.63 as an advantage for black. Now, in my estimation, I think there's two ways of looking at this position. One from an objective standpoint and one from a practical standpoint. Objectively, I feel that the position should be about dynamically equal. In a practical game, however, I think, especially if white had studied this position beforehand, that the advantage has to lie with white, because one mistake by black can create so many difficulties, and we'll see that in the game. That is to say, white can kind of move around and have a little bit more freedom, but if black makes one mistake, he's really going to be in big, big trouble. Okay. Anand thought for a really long time here. Position. Obviously, he had had some time because this was more or less theory all the way up into this point. By the way, I actually don't like the word theory. Theory implies that it's something known or it's a given, but in fact, theory is just a move that people have played before. So calling it theory gives it an aura of objectivity that really it doesn't deserve. Okay, Anand played h5. Very interesting move. I think there are two ideas behind this move. One is to stop the white queen from touching g4. Let's step back a moment and see why that g4 square is important. One idea, for example, in this position would be to play bishop e7, bishop e2, and bishop f6, not caring about the double pawns on the king side, because if he exchanges the dark square bishop, then white's advantage of the two bishops is simply gone. The problem with this, however, is that white could now play bishop takes, pawn takes, bishop takes pawn check, queen takes bishop, queen g4, and the rook on c8 will hang. And we see here that the square g4 is critical to that tactic. Okay, let's go back. So, h5, the move h5, controls that g4 square and allows then this defensive mechanism of bishop e7, bishop f6. Also, when we look at the position from white's point of view, his potential plan here would be to play h4 and then maybe h5 to crimp the black king side. So h5 not only controls g4, but stops that plan, preempts that plan. h5, however, I think is a very controversial move. Let's take a look. With h5, I think in a lot of ways it creates more problems than it solves. So I don't think black is necessarily lost here. I think he does have some big problems. And the problems have to do with what we were talking about before with the light squares. Black has no control over the light squares and should think of this almost like an opposite color bishop endgame. So when he plays h5, he weakens his white-colored complex. Clearly this pawn on h5 is on a light square and is loose. The next thing, though, probably more important, it's not so obvious, is that that pawn was controlling the g6 square. That square now is weaker. Notice now that we can put on a piece on g6 with impunity because the pawn on f7 now is pinned. So we see a whole bunch of light squares that are potentially weakened with that move h5. And I think we'll see in the game that Topalov could have used that to his advantage. Okay. I think if I was just to put out a recommendation here, I think what I would do is black, or I would do maybe after thinking about it forever in a real game I probably would just lose instantly, would be to play bishop e7, bishop e2, bishop f8, and let's just give a sample variation. Let's say white plays h4, I could play h6, white improves his position, and now simply a6. So black now has the idea of advancing the pawn, but also to say to white, once you move the white queen on c4, I'm going to take on c6 and have equality. That's the black plan, just to take that pawn on c6 the instant white moves his queen away. I think that would have been a very solid plan, and in particular, it wouldn't have given white any weaknesses for him to attack. A good rule of thumb is don't move your pawns on the side where you are weaker. And in this position, I think it's fair to say that black is weaker on the king side. So moving pawns there is going to give him some weaknesses, in particular light square weaknesses, which we just talked about. Okay, so Anand played h5. Topalov played a very sensible, practical move. He just played king g2, slowly improving the position of the pieces. His king can no longer be checked, and this is also an advantage of the light squares because this bishop on d5 not only attacks, but it controls all the defensive operations in the light squares for white. So that's a critical part of the game that we see, is that it's very hard for black to get counterplay, at least in terms of counterplay against white's king. Okay, so now black proceeded with the variation, or the idea that we just talked about, and thereby gets his bishop on f6. White clearly does not want to trade. Even though he gets the double pawns, it's not worth it to him. He wants the two bishops. Queen e7, bishop e3, rook c7, h4, bishop e5. So we can see a little bit of what Anand was hoping for, planning. You see what he's done is he's put all his pieces on dark squares because his bishop's on dark square. So his forces can't really be readily attacked on the dark squares. However, as we've discussed already, the light squares, we think all around the black's king side, are something of a chronic weakness because there's no real way that black can address them because he has no white square bishop. Now, I think we could talk a lot about Anand's last sequence of moves and if that was the best, but really that sequence proceeds from h5. That was clearly the idea he had of how he was going to arrange his pieces. And we have to also say this is clearly a practical game. Both sides are going to be nervous and taking up time, and so on and so forth. Queen e8, Queen f3. White has redirected his forces to the light squares. Black, in his turn, is realizing that the white queen cannot move off this diagonal without black recapturing on c6, willingly giving up the exchange. Okay, so in this position, black doesn't have a whole lot to do, and goes ahead, I think plays the right move, b5. He has to do something with these pawns. White goes back to bishop e3, because now it has bigger scope on this diagonal. Black plays queen e5, and I think a bit of a time pressure move here, but also laying a trick. Popolov plays queen d1. At this point, I don't think really that white's threatening all that much with queen d1. This threat of going to b3 isn't that big of a deal. And here I think Anand would have been fine by playing queen to f5, holding down all of his squares. But Anand made a very practical decision. He said, well, white's not doing anything, and I'm content with a draw in this position, so I'll play queen e8. So it looks similar to a position we just had a couple moves ago, but the difference is now that this bishop is on e3 instead of g5. That bishop on e3 will give him more scope and a lot of variation on the queen side. So, first of all, Popolov correctly now took h5. Took 6. Now we're at move 36, so there isn't that much time. So there was some time to think about what to do now. White, in my opinion, one of the reasons I like this game so much, could have now played a very elegant move on the light squares, a study-like. What's interesting about this move is actually not a move that Fritz found. It was a move that some players on the internet just kind of intuitively recommended while I was watching the game. Fritz doesn't see this move at all, and it takes him some time for him to understand it. It's a very study-like move. Let's take a look. Queen g6. Very beautiful and elegant feel. So what's really nice about this move is that the queen doesn't threaten anything directly. And of course it's on free at this. But it has several ideas. One, it keeps obviously the f7 square in check, so that the black queen has to be careful about moving. But it has several other ideas. Another one of them is that we have a lot of pressure along the 6th rank, so now the rook cannot move off the 6th rank without the bishop on d6 falling. That's one of the reasons, actually, we can see that bishop e3 is stronger and is in a stronger position than it was on g5, because now the black rook cannot go to b6. So that's... And what's very interesting is black is close to 6-1, because not only do we have the f7, he has to guard against f7 and the 6th rank problem, but also white has the simple idea of playing bishop to d4, attacking g7, and he can add to that pressure if black does nothing by playing h5 and 6. So a beautiful study-like move, which to me is reminiscent of Game 1, Bronstein's 1953 book, where we're also talking about a light square weakness, where a potential variation was there for the white pieces that wasn't played, but still was so beautiful that it gained a beautiful piece, chess history, in that 1953 book, where white could have won, as I think he could win here. So this is a little bit more complicated. Black, for example, could defend. Let's say probably his best defense, I think, is playing something like queen f8, bishop d4. Then he would have to play a move like rook c7. Let me just back up for a second to explain something. The point of queen f8 is that white cannot take the rook on c6, because that would unpin the f7 pawn, and white's queen can take it. But here, white is not... okay, so bishop d4, queen f8, probably the simplest... The rook c7, probably the simplest thing for white to take on g7, queen takes d6. And here we have a position that I would say is very difficult for black to defend, maybe lost, because the white bishop is in this position just about as strong as the rook, and the real problem for black is the continuing harassment of the f7 pawn, along with the advance, particularly of the h pawn, creating huge problems for black. So that would have been a very elegant exploitation for light squares for white. Let's go back. So, right, queen g6, I think would have been the best move. Very difficult move to find, like a study. The computer doesn't really understand it. But in a way, it's a very human move, because it has all of the characteristics of exploiting the light square. Now, a move that mortals probably would have played, that I would have played, would have been to here play bishop takes c6, queen c6, queen f3. This would have been the safe way to play. The point is, black is now basically forced to take on f3, because if he moves away, white can pick up the a7 pawn with queen a8 check, a7, or bishop takes a7. And they'll simply be up a pawn. And the point here is that when he takes, we have a bishop ending with equal pawns, but that white's king is significantly more prominent than black's. And here definitely black has problems, but maybe he can draw. But clearly white's the one who can win. This would have been the safe alternative. Okay, let's look. What Topalov did, I think we could technically call a mistake, but it's actually very instructive, I think, especially in terms of learning how Topalov thinks and why he's currently winning some games. Topalov played bishop to a7. In a way, a very curious move, because now, okay, we still have the two bishops, we've won a pawn, but now black's rook is now free to move. Anand's next move was rook a6. And clearly now what we have is a situation where it's still going to be hard for black to actually find a weakness in white's position, because clearly this pawn on a2 is completely held down by the light squared bishop, and he still has to be very careful about moving about the light squares on the king side. However, here I don't know. I think I would give an edge maybe to black. There was actually a nice debate when this game was going on. Some people saying white had compensation, other people saying that black had the advantage. In any case, it's going to be hard for white to find a concrete plan. But what we have to give Topolov intuitive credit for here is that in a game where time is a big factor, in a lot of ways it's still harder for black, because black doesn't have any counterplay, and again he still has these problems. And that's precisely what happened in this game, which I'm actually not going to spend too much time at this point going over, because it was such a magnificent game, and really it could be the subject of a lecture in itself. What happened though was that Anand blundered back the exchange. White obtained a completely winning position and probably should have simply won. It was actually not that difficult to win. Somehow, however, Topolov blew it, and I think a lot of the reason why he blew it, and I think a lot of people online didn't understand this when they were watching it, was precisely because of this incredible middle game struggle that we had, which was so deep on so many levels and took so much energy out from both of the contestants. Now, I think precisely because we have mistakes like this, it makes chess interesting, because what happens is have a titanic struggle of ideas, and one person, both people are going to be completely exhausted, and especially in a titanic struggle for the World Championship match. And this game really was one of the most deciding games, because both Anand and Topolov have to be considered favorites. Even now, I'm giving this report after round 4. This was a very decisive match. It went down to 97 moves. Anand, I think, deservedly drew the game because he was able to find resources in a position that most people would just think is hopeless. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this game, and I hope you continue enjoying the World Championship match in St. Louis, which I think, as I said before, will go down as one of the most fascinating struggles in chess history. This is International Master Jesse Kraai. Bye-bye.